All right, it is February 20th. I'm Dan Estrada. This is Engineering Ethics at NJIT. We're in Lesson 6. Let's go ahead and jump into the lesson. All right, so we're on Lesson 6. This week we'll be introducing the last of our 3 ethical theories, virtue ethics. And the goal of this week is to talk about integrity and the role of integrity as a ethical virtue. We'll talk about virtue ethics as a sort of theoretical background for this. I have some things to say about Aristotle, but there's also a lot of discussion about integrity within the context of the workplace. So we'll talk about what the virtues of professional conduct are, and we'll talk more generally about what it means to have integrity in the workplace as a professional. I have a couple of articles here, one by Sam Harris called The Good Engineer, where he talks about how virtue ethics applies to engineering. I also have this really interesting article by Lynn Sharp Payne on managing for organizational integrity. And she goes over, this is in Harvard Business Review, she goes over a lot of case studies of how failures of integrity ended up costing businesses a lot of money, a lot of time and effort to compensate for these failures of integrity. She goes over a couple of real-world cases, including Johnson & Johnson case. So this is a great article to give you some real business experience about why integrity is important. I'll say some more things about Aristotle and the philosophy. So before I go any further into the lecture, so we're on Lesson 6. This is our last sort of theory week. Next week, Lesson 7, we go over the ethical codes. I'm gonna in lecture talk about the NSPE Code of Ethics in much greater detail. And then your assignment for next week is going to be a little different from normal assignments. Next week, you're going to have to look at the Ethical Board of Ethical Review. They have a bunch of case studies from the last 50 years, and you can go through those case studies and look at not just particular cases that might apply to your engineering field, but also how the Code of Ethics applies to these cases, and then some analysis from the Board of Ethical Review, where they actually give a conclusion about whether someone was guilty or not guilty of an ethical violation. So next lesson, Lesson 7, so this is Lesson 6. Next week, Lesson 7, we're going to go over the NSP Code of Ethics in some more detail. Lesson 8, we do our next big case study, which is the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I've got lots of resources to talk about there. Lesson 9, we'll do climate change and geoengineering. This is another case study. It's a little less focused than the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, but we're going to look at cases of geoengineering and whether that's ever appropriate, what that really means. I also have a lot of things to say about our climate situation. And then Lessons 10 and 11, after that, are your own research project. So again, we're on Lesson 6 right now. Lessons 10 and 11 are where you're going to be doing your own research. You're going to have to do scholarly research in order to complete this project. So you might want to start thinking now about what case you want to study, maybe even start doing some library research or some online research to find cases that you're interested in, some research to back up your essay. I have examples of cases of engineering ethics, mostly major disasters, but also some security issues. If you want to go deeper into the issue of sexual harassment or other kinds of discrimination in the workplace, we don't talk a whole lot about that, but it's definitely relevant. If you want to talk more about gift giving and bribery, which is another big sort of business ethics issue, we'll talk about a little bit today when we talk about integrity, but that's another topic to cover. Lessons 10 and 11, you're going to have to pick your own case to study, so start thinking about these cases now. I have some resources on Moodle, and you can get this going. But I'll back up again. After your research project, we get into the artificial intelligence unit. We have 3 weeks where we're talking about artificial intelligence and its impact on the economy and the social sphere. And that's the last major unit of the course. So we're moving through. Hope this is going well with you. Let me go ahead and jump into Prezi. All right, so Lesson 6, Virtues, Ethics, Integrity, and Organization. So the term virtue ethics, when you hear this term, I'm not exactly sure what you think, but when a philosopher uses this term, what they mean is something like excellence. The Greek word here is arete. Arete means excellence. Excellence in the sense of best. do your best, give it your best shot, right? Be the best you can be. The best here is not just the good. So remember when we talked about consequentialism, consequentialists want to maximize the good, and they think the good is happiness. And so if more people are happy than unhappy, then things are good. But being happy to satisfy a consequentialist doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best situation overall, right? The consequentialist isn't arguing for maximizing efficiency or sort of optimizing anything, except just that more people are happy than unhappy. So virtue ethics is about more than just the good, but it's about the best. It's about achieving a standard of excellence more than just that the good outweighs the bad. The virtues are not exactly about the right. So remember with deontology is about the duties and obligations we face, the permissions that we have, and so on, right? The rules that bind us. The consequentialists only care about the outcomes. The deontologists care about the rules. And the virtue ethicists are skeptical that you can characterize excellence in terms of rules. In fact, virtue ethicists often make the argument explicitly that ethics is just too complicated to summarize in a set of rules. So you can't know the best thing to do just by following the right rules. And you can't also sort of merely increase the good. For the virtue ethicists, you also have to be the best you can be, right? You also have to be excellent. So we'll talk about this view a little bit, and then we'll talk about how it relates to professional ethics for engineers. Just a few things to say right off the bat, though. The other two theories that we looked at, consequentialism and deontology, the good and the right. So have the good, the right, and the best. The good and the right, the discussion of these, we've been having these discussions for a long time, but the theories have come into their own really in the last few hundred years. So these are relatively modern theories. And virtue ethics is a much older theory. Virtue ethics has analogs in all of the different religions of the ancient world. I only have a sampling of them here, but Aristotle in ancient Greece, Confucius in China, Buddha also in China. All of these ancient worldviews, and these are not necessarily religious views, although Confucianism and Buddhism are both major world religions. They were started here by, these people weren't divine when they started these religions, right? These religions, they weren't religious people. Confucius was a bureaucrat. He was a politician who had a lot of influence and wrote these manuals about how to engage civic life, and these essays ended up becoming very, very influential. Buddha was a priest, right? He was a human being. He was a priest who ends up trying to escape the civilized life to find some peace. Aristotle was also just, he was a philosopher. He was in ancient Greece. He's the guy that I know best because I'm a philosopher myself. But all three of these thinkers had a view that looks a lot like virtue ethics, and in particular, they all share this view. So Aristotle calls it the doctrine of the mean. Confucius and Aristotle have variations of the same view, the middle way, the golden mean. And the view is that what excellence is, what makes something the best, is that it is situated between two extremes. In other words, it's the happy middle between two extremes. You might think of this as the sort of Goldilocks view of ethics. You remember the Goldilocks story where Goldilocks goes into the house and there's the porridge. The papa's porridge is too hot and the mama's porridge is too cold, and the baby's porridge is just right? So the baby's porridge is exactly that middle ground between too hot and too cold. Well, this is the ethical view of basically the entire ancient world, that the excellent way, the good way, the best way, is to find the middle ground between the extremes, right? So extremes on either side are bad. The middle ground is the good way, the best way. Like I said, I know Aristotle best. Aristotle himself was not a religious figure, but he ends up being very influential, especially on modern Christian theology. He was very influential for St. Thomas Aquinas, for instance. And the way that Aristotle talks about the virtues is by distinguishing them between, so the virtuous is right in the middle, and it's between excess in both directions, so an excess of deficiency and an excess, I'm sorry, a vice of deficiency and a vice of excess. So there's the middle ground between too much and too little. So deficiency is too little, excess is too much. Let's just take this first mean, courage. Courage like bravery. Aristotle's view is that courage is a virtue. It's the best way a person can be is to be a courageous person. Not just a courageous person, there's lots of virtues, but one way that you might be excellent is by being a courageous person. And on Aristotle's analysis, courage is between too little and too much. So the too little is cowardice. If you don't have enough courage, then you're a coward. Right? And being cowardly is bad. But if you have too much courage, then you're rash or sort of foolishly brave. Right? So someone who runs into the burning building without really thinking about what's going on. Right? So imagine I'm a firefighter, and a courageous firefighter, will have the courage to run into a building to save people who are trapped in a burning building. The coward would just run away, wouldn't even take the risk. But the idea is that the firefighter is courageous when they take the right risks. And there's some risks that aren't worth taking, and that even the firefighters won't take. Right? So if the house is about to collapse, and if everyone can see that the house is about to collapse, then maybe you shouldn't run into the house. Maybe you would just be foolish to run into the house. And maybe the brave thing to do is to wait until the house collapses and then run in. Maybe that's the actual right thing to do. Of course, that's for the firefighter to decide. But the idea is that the best firefighters know when to make that move, right? Know when to be courageous, and know how to distinguish that from cowardice on the one hand and rashness on the other. So this is the general view from Aristotle, that the best way is to be in the middle. Notice how this is different from both consequentialism and deontology. Consequentialists don't want you to be moderate. Consequentialists sometimes require that you take an extreme action, like pulling the lever and killing a bunch of people. So consequentialists sometimes require that you take an extreme action in order to maximize the good. There might be problems with that. In fact, some of the reasons that we are skeptical of the trolley problem sort of consequentialist cases is precisely because they require of us extreme actions that we're not willing to take, right? Pushing the man onto the tracks. Maybe that's just too far. We're not willing to go that far. Right? And the idea here is it's not that the consequences aren't worthwhile, but that the action is too extreme, and that we'd rather be moderate. I want to say that human psychology in general, when we conform, what we're conforming to is the moderate view. That we're being pulled in all sorts of directions. Our bosses want one thing, our values want another thing, our family wants another thing. Right? So we're being pulled in all these directions. And what our psychology tries to do is it tries to find a balance between all these directions that we're pulled, find some middle ground that we're comfortable in. Right? So all these ancient thinkers are trying to emphasize the importance of finding the comfortable middle ground. Right, so the general consensus here is that extremism is bad and moderation is good, and you want to find the moderate points. And so consequentialists don't think you need to be moderate. Deontologists also don't think you need to be moderate. Deontologists think that you need to follow the rules, whatever they are, and sometimes that might require extreme action as well. Aristotle's view is that what's good is what's appropriate to the situation. So anger, for instance, is not always a bad thing. It's not always extreme. Sometimes anger is appropriate on Aristotle's view. Sometimes you should be angry. Right? The middle ground doesn't always mean passivity and sort of non-reaction. Sometimes reaction is appropriate to a situation. So taking a stand, getting angry at a situation might be appropriate. Getting too angry, though, is inappropriate. Not getting angry enough is inappropriate. Right? You want to find that comfortable middle ground, and for the virtue ethicists, there might not be a right way of doing this. Right? There might not be any simple rules that'll help you find where that middle ground is. So this is where things get complicated. Aristotle says that regardless of what you want, human beings are creatures of habit. Aristotle says we are what we do repeatedly. You might not think that you're a bad person, but if you keep doing bad things, if you develop bad habits, that makes you a bad person. Even if it's not what you want inside, this is what Aristotle thinks, that you are what you do repeatedly. And so Aristotle thinks that the solution to the problem is to develop good habits. It's not to always consciously think about what you're doing, because that's really hard. And there's no right rules that make sure that you always do the right thing anyway. So Aristotle says the best way of making sure you do the best thing is by developing good habits, virtuous habits that encourage you to do what's best. Part of Aristotle's point here is that ethics goes all the way down, virtues go all the way down. They're not just things that you can do sometimes. You know, if I tell the truth most of the time, when it doesn't matter, but when it becomes important, I lie, right? When push comes to shove and there's some big issue on the table, that's when I lie. You know, I lie to save my reputation, lie to save my friends. If I'm lying in the big moments, then it doesn't really matter that I'm telling the truth all the other times. What matters in those big moments is that I'm lying. So in order to do the best on Aristotle's view, you need to not just tell the truth, but develop a habit of telling the truth so that it comes naturally. Yeah, so that comes naturally to you. Maybe I'm going to skip down here. This might seem familiar if you know Christian theology. So Aristotle distinguishes when there's the right thing to do. Aristotle distinguishes between different ways we might do the right thing. One way is the virtuous person. The virtuous person does the right thing in the right way for the right reason, as a matter of habit. The virtuous person in Aristotle's view doesn't have to think very hard about being virtuous, but just does the right thing, because that's who they are. Now, maybe for some things it's not hard to do the right thing. You know, maybe if you never picked up the habit of smoking, then maybe not smoking is not very hard for you, right? It's pretty easy for you to turn down cigarettes for not thinking about cigarettes, right? So maybe being virtuous with regard to smoking is pretty easy. Maybe there's other things that you get tempted by. So there's lots of different virtues that you might have. Being virtuous in any one way is about doing the right thing in the right way. But most of us can't be virtuous. It's really hard to always do the right thing in the right way. For one thing, you have to learn what the right thing is, and Aristotle understands that being virtuous is not a matter of always doing the right thing, but it's about developing these virtuous habits. And part of what's required to develop these habits is to sometimes fail. So Aristotle recognizes that sometimes good people do bad things, maybe because they're learning, maybe because it's just really hard to do the right thing. So on Aristotle's view, let me go back to the beginning. On Aristotle's view, it's not enough to judge people by their individual actions, because people change who they are over time. It takes practice to be a good person. So you can't judge people by their individual actions. Sometimes good people do wrong things. But what you want to judge them by is their character. And this is novel in the ethical theories that we've looked at. Both consequentialism and deontology are looking at particular actions you take. Does it maximize the good? Does it follow the rules? Does it exercise your obligations and duties? Right? Those are about particular actions and their relationship to morality. Aristotle thinks it's not just about the actions, but it's about the person. It's about who they are, their character, right? So it goes all the way down. Have they developed the good habits? Doing the good thing, doing the right thing in a particular situation is good. You should do the right thing, but it's more important that you develop the habits of doing the right thing over time, because having good habits is how I can trust you to do the good thing in the future, right? So this is why ethics is about integrity. Integrity isn't just about doing the right thing, but it's about doing the right thing reliably so that you're a stable source of ethical action. Doing the right thing in particular cases might not be that difficult, but doing the right thing repeatedly, developing that good habit, that's the hard part, and that's the part that has to be worked on sort of diligently. Okay, so let me jump up down here, actually. So this is a virtuous person who does the right thing for the right reason. There's also the vicious person at the opposite end. The vicious person knows what the right thing is, but does the opposite deliberately because they see no reason to do the right thing and they just want to do the wrong thing. More than that, the vicious person does the wrong thing as a matter of habit. So not only do they do the wrong thing at one time, but they've developed a habit of doing the wrong thing. And on Aristotle's view, just as most people aren't fully virtuous, also most people aren't fully vicious. On Aristotle's view, most people fall in the middle somewhere. And Aristotle distinguishes between two kinds of middle ground, the continent and the incontinent person. Continent sort of means able, capable. The continent person is a person who knows what the right thing to do is, but struggles with it. It's really hard, and maybe they're really tempted to do the wrong thing. Imagine that, let's just say for the sake of argument that smoking is wrong, and I know that I shouldn't smoke cigarettes, but I really want to, and there's this struggle that I have, and sort of internal struggle with, do I give in to my addiction, or do I stay strong and go another day without smoking? The continent person is the person who eventually does the right thing and doesn't smoke, but has to go through this struggle. It's very difficult. The incontinent person, on the other hand, also goes through the same struggle, knows the right thing to do, and goes through this struggle, but fails to do the right thing, and ends up giving into their addiction and smoking a cigarette, or whatever the bad thing is. The vicious person knows what the right thing to do is, but deliberately chooses not to do that thing. Right? The continent person at least wants to do the right thing, and eventually fails to do the right thing, right after a great struggle. Aristotle thinks that most people are either continent or incontinent, are able to do the right thing or not able to do the right thing. And that's fine. It's better to be continent than incontinent. But Aristotle says that it's even better. I mean, be continent if you can, but it's even better to be virtuous. The idea is that it's better to do the right thing without a struggle than to do the right thing and have to struggle to do it. Just in the sense that if it's easier to do it, you're more likely to do the right thing. And so you're more likely to do the right thing if you're a virtuous person, Aristotle thinks. But being a virtuous person isn't necessarily easy. It's a lifelong project. You make mistakes. You have to learn from those mistakes and get better. And importantly for Aristotle, I guess this is one of the things on the optional list, is this moral luck. That Aristotle thinks that some people have it easier to be virtuous than others. Like I said, if you've never smoked a cigarette in your life, then it's not going to be that hard for you to turn down cigarettes. But if you have an existing addiction, then turning down that cigarette is going to be very hard. And understanding that people might face the same choices and have different, approach those choices differently and have a different struggle in doing the right thing in those choices. Even Aristotle knew this 2,000 years ago. Aristotle's example is the beautiful people versus the ugly people. So Aristotle thinks that living the good life, actually, let me actually back up here and go to this one that I missed. So Aristotle says it's hard. It's hard to know what the right thing to do is, especially because you can't have a bunch of rules to tell you what the right thing to do is. So how do we know what the right thing is? How do we know what the moderate position is between the two extremes? And the trick here is that what is moderate depends on who you are, and it depends on what you're doing, what you're trying to do. The right calorie intake for me is going to be different from the right calorie intake for you, because we're different people, we have different bodies, we have different activities, daily activities that we go through. These differences between who we are mean that the right amount of food for me is going to be different from the right amount of food for you. Right? So what's moderate? It depends on who you are. Even still, though, Aristotle thinks that even though every creature has a different goal, there's still a goal that we're all trying to achieve, Aristotle thinks. He calls it the good life. The Greek word is eudaimonia, or eudaimonia. Eu meaning good, and daimon meaning spirit. The good life. The good life, not just the life of pleasure, but the life well lived. A healthy life. Not just physically healthy, but mentally healthy, socially healthy, right? That you're doing well. For human beings, Aristotle thinks the good life involves rational reflection on your action. It also involves things like civic engagement, political activity, ethical activity, and things like friendship. You need friends to live a good life, for Aristotle. And this is Aristotle's example of how sometimes things are harder for some people. So Aristotle thinks that you need friends to live a good life, but some people have an easier time making friends than others. Aristotle says there's the beautiful people and the ugly people. Ugly people just have a hard time making friends. Beautiful people find it very easy to make friends. And this isn't a choice on their part. It's not that the beautiful people chose to be beautiful and the ugly people chose to be ugly. Some people are just beautiful and some people are just ugly. This is what Aristotle says. It's not the ugly people's fault that they're ugly. Maybe they were just born to ugly parents. But being ugly means that they're going to have a harder time making friends, simply because that's how people work. Not that there's anything wrong with being ugly, but it represents a greater challenge, a greater struggle in order to make friends. And all people need friends to have a good life. And so ugly people just have a harder time living a good life. Not that there's anything bad about who they are, or that they've done anything wrong, but that they just face a greater challenge in making friends. Aristotle says the same thing about rich people versus poor people. Maybe one of the virtues is being generous. Generosity is a virtue. Well, if you're rich and you have a lot to give away, then maybe it's easier for you to be generous. And if you're poor and you don't have very much, then maybe it's harder for you to be generous, right? And maybe being generous is part of what makes a good person, makes a good life, but maybe some people struggle more with that than others. This is this concept of moral luck, that we don't always have control over our circumstances, and the decisions that we make aren't always in our control either. Sometimes people have a harder time doing things than others for reasons that are entirely out of their hands. So one of the things you might think about this lesson is whether moral luck is an actual thing, or whether people actually do have control over their actions. I can refer to lots of things that we've talked about, the Dennis Joya case, the David Foster Wallace, This is Water, learning to think is a real goal of education. Right? Think about learning what to think about, to have control over what you think about. Well, maybe some people just don't have that control for circumstances entirely beyond their control. Right? So what do we do about ethics in cases where you don't have that control? Right? This is the question of moral luck. There's just a few things more I want to say for this lesson. In the textbook, they do talk about the virtues particular to engineering. So we've been talking about virtues generally just so you understand the theory of virtue ethics. But the book talks in some detail about the virtues of professionalism and in particular virtues of engineering. Let me just sort of talk about some of these. The public-spirited virtues. A lot of what's in the Code of Ethics are these public-spirited virtues. Virtues about your relationship with and obligations to the larger community, right? So promoting the health, safety, welfare of the public. This is a kind of public-spirited virtue, in the sense that being a good professional requires this kind of attention to the public space, to the public sphere. Not just because it's a rule that you ought to follow, not just because it increases the general consequences for the better, but because it's a virtue. It's an example of what an excellent professional does. The virtue that you're probably most familiar with for engineering are the proficiency virtues, where you actually master the technical skills. Most of what you're doing in college is learning these technical skills, becoming competent in using these skills, so that when you go on the job market, you are a good engineer, or whatever your career is, that you know what you're doing. So that's pretty obvious. Some of these other virtues we've talked about a little bit. The teamwork virtues, playing well with others, cooperativeness. Not just the public-facing virtues, but the sort of collegiate virtues towards your peers, towards your bosses, and so on. The reason I'm going through this in some detail, and the book goes over in more detail, but is because I wanted to focus on these autonomy virtues. The autonomy virtues are about self-control and discipline. And integrity, the book talks about integrity as falling under these autonomy virtues. Reflective judgment, perseverance, courage, commitment. Right? These are not virtues about how you relate to the broader society, and they're not virtues about how you relate to your peers, but they're really virtues about how you relate to yourself, right? How you relate to your own values. And this is why I want to talk about integrity with some care. In some sense, integrity is the virtue. It's the main ethical principle that underlies all discussions of ethics. So integrity, this is from the Google definition. Integrity is the quality of being honest or having strong moral principles, moral uprightness. And you often find integrity associated with honesty. But having integrity is not just about being honest in any particular action. If I'm, like I said at the beginning, if I'm honest sometimes, but when it really comes down to it, I'll tell a lie to save my own hide, then I don't really have integrity, right? I just told the truth a couple of times, but that's not really honesty in the sense of a character trait. I'm not demonstrating integrity in my character. So integrity here has to do with not just being honest or doing good, doing the right thing, but about being whole and stable as an ethical agent. So I want to refer to integrity that has more direct associations with engineering, right? So the state of being whole or undivided, the state of being of sound construction, right? Unimpaired, unified, structurally unified, solid, dependable, reliable, stable, tough. Right? This is a sense of integrity that I think matters, right? So integrity being whole or solid, being consistent, dependable, having strong principles, especially honesty, but in general, having a strong identity, a clear identity as a moral agent. Someone with integrity, you know what they're going to do, because they've shown consistent character of doing that thing in the past. So I want to say that integrity is the main, the fundamental, foundational ethical principle, and that you need to have integrity for doing anything. So maybe the first thing to talk about here is the relationship to some of the discussions we've already had in class. Because the virtue ethicist admits that you can't always follow the rules to know what the moderate position is, what the excellent thing to do is. Because you can't always follow rules, then it's sometimes hard to know what the right thing to do is. And the solution to this from the virtue ethicists is to look at particular models. Models that we can look at for inspiration, for understanding how they acted. Right, so maybe you're familiar with, from the Christian tradition, what would Jesus do? You see some people with the bracelet sometimes, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Right, and the idea here is that not just that Jesus gave a bunch of rules for how to act, but that Jesus himself is a model of action. And so if I want to know what to do myself, then I might ask myself, what would Jesus do in this situation? And then by thinking about what he would do, I can decide what is best for me to do as well. If you don't like Jesus, then ask what Aristotle would do, or what Buddha would do, or Confucius would do, maybe, or other moral figures. So those are the religious examples, but maybe for this class, the better examples are the characters we've looked at in class, right? So Ernst Fitzgerald in the C5A, right? He was a model of virtue. He told the truth when he went in front of the Senate to talk about the plane, to talk about the cost overruns. Right? So what would Ernst Fitzgerald do? You might ask yourself, when you find yourself in a difficult situation, what would this person do? Or what would Chelsea Manning do, or Edward Snowden? Right? These are characters that have gone through that situation of blowing the whistle before. Right? And you might look to what they did. How did it turn out for them? What lessons can I learn from their models of action for organizing my own behavior? You might also look for the vicious examples, right? Dennis Joya or Eichmann, how they responded. Are they examples of virtue that you want to emulate, or are they examples of virtue that you want to avoid? Not just looking at particular persons and their characters, but also looking at all these cases, right? So, right now we've seen cases where a bunch of people die in giant explosions or giant gas balls of fire in cars. Right? We've seen people making ethically difficult decisions, and how that turns out. Right? So instead of just thinking about what the rules are, we can also refer to these moral characters. And part of the reason that we're able to refer to these moral characters is because they demonstrate a kind of integrity, or maybe a failure of integrity. And we can use that to understand who they are as an agent, right? The kinds of decisions that they're making. All right. What I want to close on just in the lecture, and we'll pick up some of these things in the Hangout, maybe this week, maybe next week. The secret word for this week, by the way, is organism. The thing I want to close on this week is to think about the role of integrity, not just as a moral issue for professionals in engineering, but as a fundamental constraint on the organization of any complex system, including not just yourself as a moral agent, you are a complex system, but also the companies that you work for, the businesses that you work for, they're complex organizations. Actually, as I'm saying this, let me play this video. This video is of Autodesk Research, which is an actual company. this is going to be a complex network of activity with three different kinds of agents. The employees are the big circles, and the small circles are the... I'm sorry, the small circles are the employees, and the big circles are the managers. So this is Autodesk Incorporated. This is over a few years, from 2007 to 2011. And this is the organizational chart of the company. So what you're seeing here is the structure of the company, how all of the manager, boss, employee relationships work. The CEO is the middle of the circle, and then if you sort of fan out from the circle, you get less and less power. And you can see how these sections of the company all jostle around, reorganized, and companies are through structural changes. Some of these components are more independent than others. Some of them are deeply integrated, some relatively isolated. In fact, some rather big chunks of the network are relatively isolated. At some point in this video, I don't know if it's already passed, the company reorganizes itself from a from a product-based one to an industry-focused one. The reorganization of the company from a product company to an industry-focused company, this is a major organizational shift, and you can see that it has all these consequences for the structure of the company. Now, my point here is not to say that this company lacks integrity. My point is to show you what the integrity of the company looks like. So here's this company adjusting itself to the consumer demands, to market demands, adjusting its own structure to these external influences, and it maintains itself as a company for several years. Actually, this is a sustainable, organized system that has this structure in response to all these external forces, and it sort of creates this structure and adjusts it on the fly in order to meet these various needs. Right, so maintaining these structures is what allows organizations to function as they do, to stay stable over time, to be successful as they are. This is true for businesses. It's also true for persons. Right? It's also true for the integrity of individual persons. So to make this point sort of philosophically, in the general sense, remember the secret word for the lecture is organism, I just wanted to focus on what the term organization means. Organization, it comes from the Latin word organon. It comes from the Proto-Indo-European word, which is the source of all Indo-European languages. The Proto-Indo-European word is werg. This is where we get our word work. The word werg is the action word, to do, to work. Organon, the erg, in organ, organize, organism, right? The erg here comes from the word work, right? The idea is that an organ is an instrument, is a tool that does something for an organized system. Right? So think of yourself, you're an organism, you have a bunch of organs, like your heart. It performs some action for the organism, right? The heart pumps blood, right? It's just it's moving the circulatory system. All my other organs have other specialized parts, right? Not all my organs are pumping blood. My stomach does something else. My lungs do something else. Right? All these organs are performing work for the overall system. And me, as an organism, I'm able to stay alive because all of my parts are performing their function in the right way, in such a way that it's all connected together to sustain me as the whole system. Right. So what it means to be an organism is to be a tool for an organization. An organ is a tool for an organism. An organ is a tool for an organization. And this stuff only works in an organized way when the parts have integrity, when the parts are consistent and reliable, when my heart is a well-functioning organ. Right? If my heart is not beating well, right, then I, as a living system, become compromised, right, because of a failure of the integrity of the parts. Now, there's a lot of abstract things to say about the relationship to biological life, to digital systems. I'll say some of that in Hangouts, maybe, if we have the time. The thing I wanted to emphasize on in this lecture is with respect to the Payne article from the readings. Let me pull that up one more time. This is this Lynchart Payne article, Managing for Organizational Integrity. And the big thing that she talks about in this article is that integrity is more than just compliance. In the professional world, especially in engineering, there's going to be a bunch of regulations, OSHA regulations or whatever, and you need to meet the regulations or else you're not compliant and then you might get fined for it or whatever. We'll see when we do the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that sometimes you can get away with not meeting the standards for a long time and still not get into very much trouble. But if you're not as big as BP, maybe sometimes you do get in trouble for failing to be in compliance. The important point here is that integrity is more than just compliance. Compliance is like meeting the minimum standards, right? These are the required. You have to meet these standards, or else you'll incur a fine. You'll get in trouble. Compliance is doing the minimum required to meet those standards. Integrity is doing what those rules are meant to achieve. Right? It's not just doing the minimum, but it's understanding why that minimum is there and meeting the core values and commitments that inform that minimum in the first place. So, right. So the difference between compliance and integrity. So, ethics management, compliance strategy for ethics is conforming to externally imposed standards, whereas integrity is about self-governing according to chosen standards. Right, where it's not just these are the rules they tell me to do, and so I've got to follow the rules because they told me. The integrity is actually understanding what those rules are, choosing them for yourself, and then governing yourself according to those rules. The compliance version of objective ethics management is preventing criminal misconduct, whereas the integrity strategy here is enabling responsible conduct, right? So not just preventing the crimes, but encouraging the excellent behavior. Compliance strategy for leadership is usually lawyer-driven. Lawyers are the people that are hounding the business to follow the rules. If the lawyers are driving the leadership of the company, you know that you're in a compliance strategy, that you're just following the rules. The integrity strategy is really management-driven. The lawyers are informing the management decisions, but the managements have their own sense of integrity that's informing their behavior, and not just what the externally imposed laws are. There's more to say here about the distinction between compliance and integrity in that Payne article. But I think this is important. I think maybe this is a good addition to what we've talked about already from deontology about following the rules. It's not just about following the rules, but it's about following the rules with integrity, with having some core commitment to the principles that inform your action as opposed to mere compliance. I have more to say about personal integrity. I have more to say about how this hooks up with sort of broader philosophical themes. And we'll say that in the Hangout. I think that's going to wrap up our lecture for today. I hope this is informative. I hope it helps you introduce you to the material to read this week. Good. Let me say goodbye. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you next week.